It began with a silence louder than any scream. In a quiet neighborhood where life hummed in its usual monotony, a woman vanished. No warning, no trace. Just an absence that grew heavier with each passing hour. What her neighbors would later uncover went far beyond their worst nightmares. Behind these walls lay secrets that would shake the foundation of their small community and haunt anyone who heard the story. This was a row house neighborhood where people lived shoulder to shoulder, separated only by walls too thin to silence the daily rhythm of life. Nothing was truly private. A cough, a laugh, even the clatter of dishes. It was here, in these narrow homes, that neighbors shared more than space. They shared the eerie knowledge that something wasn't quite right with one of their own. And yet, no one could have imagined just how wrong things would go. Her disappearance seemed ordinary at first. People go missing every day, don't they? But this wasn't just another case of missing persons. The strange, persistent noises that filtered through the shared walls held clues that no one pieced together until it was too late. Her neighbor knew more than anyone suspected. What he was doing in the shadows of his basement, just a few feet from where she had lived her life, would eventually come to light most horrifyingly. I've lived in homes like these, where a neighbor's footsteps can feel inside your walls. That feeling of proximity can be comforting or unsettling, depending on who you share it with. But this story forces us to confront a chilling question. How well do we truly know the person just on the other side? The case begins with a missing woman, but what unfolds next reveals something far darker. A hidden world beyond the bricks. A world so terrifying forces us to reconsider what safety means when the walls we trust to protect us are so easily breached. The neighborhood was like so many others. A row of modest houses standing side by side, each connected to the next, forming a tight, almost suffocating pattern. These homes weren't just connected by brick and mortar. They shared lives, routines, and sometimes secrets. The brick walls, old and brittle, carried every sound, voices, footsteps, and sometimes things no one wanted to hear. It was a place where privacy was an illusion, yet some truths stayed hidden in the shadows. The missing woman, Helen Carter, was the kind of person who didn't stand out in a crowd, but everyone seemed to know her. She had lived alone for years, her days filled with work at a small office and evenings spent tending to the plants in her backyard. Helen was dependable and polite, never one to cause trouble or draw attention. Her neighbors admired her dedication to her little garden, a patch of green amidst the gray of the row houses. But behind her quiet demeanor was a woman who felt safe in her routines and small, predictable life. Just a few feet away, on the other side of the wall, lived someone entirely different. His name was Josh Morgan. Josh was the kind of man whose presence unsettled people without him needing to say much. He kept to himself, often seen pacing his yard at odd hours or standing in his window, staring out at nothing, or perhaps at everything. He worked nights, or so he claimed, and the noises from his home were unlike anything the neighbors were used to. The hammering, the clatter of tools, and the muffled sounds that went late into the night always felt out of place in the otherwise quiet street. Josh's behavior didn't go unnoticed. The neighbors whispered about him, their hushed conversations laced with unease. People spoke of the strange way he moved, his slow, deliberate gestures, and the unsettling intensity in his eyes. Helen, living right next door, had her encounters with him. She mentioned to a co-worker once that he would watch her whenever she left or returned home, his gaze unbroken, as if memorizing every detail of her movements. She laughed it off, calling him odd but harmless. But those who heard the story didn't laugh. They felt the unease she wouldn't admit. And then there were the noises. Helen complained to a friend about the banging on the shared wall at all hours of the night. She said it sounded like someone hammering or dragging something heavy, though she couldn't imagine what. Sometimes, the banging stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving her awake in the silence, staring at the ceiling. When asked why she didn't report it or confront Josh, she would shrug and say, "It's just one of those things you live within a place like this." She brushed it off as part of the quirks of living so close to another person. But the truth was, Helen didn't feel entirely comfortable in her home anymore. She didn't say it outright, but her friends noticed small changes. She installed thicker curtains on her windows and started locking her doors earlier in the evening. She even mentioned considering a move, though she never followed through. Looking back, those signs feel all too clear. But at the time, they seemed like nothing more than small inconveniences of city life. Everyone in the neighborhood had suspicions about Josh, but no one ever acted on them. Perhaps it was easier to ignore the oddities, to pretend nothing was wrong. After all, Josh had lived there for years without incident. But those years of silence and unspoken hesitations would haunt them all when Helen stopped showing up for work one day. It wasn't just a neighbor disappearing, unraveling everything they thought they knew about the walls that separated them. Helen Carter was the type of person who didn't just vanish. She was dependable and never missed a shift or failed to call if she was running late. So, when she didn't show up for work one morning, her co-workers noticed immediately. The hours ticked by, and her absence grew more alarming with each passing moment. No calls, no messages, nothing. It was as if she had been erased overnight. Her co-workers tried reaching her, dialing her phone repeatedly, but the calls went unanswered. Concern quickly turned into unease. Helen wasn't the type to disappear. By the end of the day, her employer, worried and unsure what else to do, contacted the police for a wellness check. It wasn't panic. It was a precaution. But what the officers would find in the coming hours was far beyond what anyone expected. When officers arrived at Helen's home, everything seemed undisturbed. Her car was parked in its usual spot, and the front door was locked. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anything was out of place. But as they entered the house, a heavy, unshakable silence settled over them. The kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. They called out for Helen, their voices echoing back at them unanswered. Room by room they searched, looking for anything that might explain her absence. The kitchen was tidy, the living room undisturbed. Her bed was neatly made upstairs, as though she had left for work like any other day. But something felt wrong. That silence pressed down harder as they moved through the house, an invisible weight they couldn't shake. When they reached the basement door, they first heard it, a sound that didn't belong. The hum of an electric saw buzzed faintly from below, its steady rhythm breaking the oppressive stillness. It was unexpected, almost ordinary, except that Helen was nowhere to be found. One officer called for backup while the other descended the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last. The officers exchanged a glance, their unease giving way to dread. What could be on the other side of that wall? They crouched to peer through the opening, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. What they saw was something out of a nightmare. On the other side, in the neighbor's basement, stood Josh Morgan, his back to them. The electric saw in his hands buzzed angrily as he leaned over a workbench. The floor around him was stained with something dark and unmistakable. And then they saw it, a figure, lifeless and dismembered, sprawled across the bench. The officers froze, their breath caught in their throats. It took a moment for them to process what they were seeing. Josh didn't notice them, and his focus was entirely on his gruesome task. The officers radioed for immediate backup, their voices shaking as they described the scene. They moved quickly to breach the neighboring home, storming the basement to subdue the man living next to Helen all this time. Josh Morgan was arrested on the spot, his hands and clothes drenched in blood. The neighborhood began to stir as the officers led him out of the house. Curious eyes peered from behind curtains, watching as the man who had always seemed off was taken away in handcuffs. But for Helen, it was already too late. The truth of what had happened to her lay within those walls, forever changing the lives of everyone who lived on that quiet street. Peering through the broken wall, the officers were confronted with a sight they could never have imagined. The neighbor, Josh Morgan, stood there, covered in blood, his hands trembling as he worked on what could only be described as a horrific scene. The body of Helen Carter, dismembered and lifeless, lay on the workbench before him. She had been there all along. just one wall away from the life she had built, a life now brutally destroyed. The officers wasted no time. They stormed into Josh's basement, commanding him to drop the saw. He turned slowly, his expression blank, almost detached, as though he were waking from a dream. Josh offered no resistance. He stood silently as they restrained him. The blood on his hands now smeared across his clothes as they led him out into the night. At the station, Josh sat in eerie silence, answering questions with monosyllabic replies or refusing to speak altogether. The officers were left with more questions than answers. What had driven him to commit such an act? How long had this darkness been lurking just behind the walls? And most hauntingly, had anyone missed the signs? As the investigation unfolded, Josh's past began to take shape, a patchwork of disturbing behaviors that had somehow gone unnoticed or unreported. He had lived alone for years, rarely interacting with his neighbors beyond the occasional unnerving stare. Those who knew him described him as strange but harmless, someone who kept to himself and didn't seem to pose a threat. But there were cracks in this facade. Neighbors recalled odd moments that, in hindsight, seemed far more sinister. The loud noises at night, the sounds of tools used for hours, and the banging on the shared walls that Helen had mentioned to her friends. One neighbor remembered when Josh was seen dragging a large, heavy tarp into his basement late at night. At the time, they dismissed it as nothing out of the ordinary. Now, they wondered if it had been something far darker. Theories began to emerge as investigators dug deeper into Josh's background. His medical records hinted at untreated mental illness, a long history of erratic behavior, and prior incidents that never escalated beyond whispers and rumors. Was his crime the result of a complete mental breakdown? Or had he been planning this all along? The signs were there, but they had been ignored, dismissed as the eccentricities of a quiet, reclusive man. Some wondered if the thin walls and constant proximity had played a role in his unraveling. Living just feet apart, with every noise amplified and privacy stripped away. Could it have driven him to the edge? Or was Josh simply a man hiding his true nature in plain sight, his quiet demeanor a mask for something much darker? Helen's friends and family struggled to comprehend how this could have happened. They looked back on the moments they had shared with her, searching for any sign that she had been in danger. But Helen, ever kind and optimistic, had brushed off the oddities of her neighbor. She had seen him as strange, perhaps lonely, but never dangerous. It was a mistake that cost her everything. The police continued to piece together the events leading up to that night, hoping to answer the lingering questions. But some questions seemed destined to remain unanswered, locked away in the mind of a man who now refused to speak. What had happened in the days leading up to Helen's disappearance? Had she confronted Josh? Had he been watching her, waiting for the right moment? And most chillingly, had he planned for it to happen all along? The community, once quiet and close-knit, was left to grapple with its guilt. How had they missed the signs? Could someone have intervened, or was this horror inevitable? As the news of Helen's tragic end spread, the row houses that had once echoed with the sounds of daily life were now consumed by silence, an unspoken acknowledgement that the trust between neighbors had been shattered forever. The case should have ended with his arrest. Josh Morgan had been caught red-handed, the horrors of his crime laid bare for all to see. He was subdued, handcuffed, and escorted to the station, a moment that should have brought some sense of closure to a nightmare that had unfolded in a quiet neighborhood. But what happened next would deepen the mystery and leave everyone with questions that would never be answered. Josh was processed without resistance, his expression blank, almost eerily calm. Officers noted his silence as they booked him and his lack of reaction to the chaos surrounding him. It was as if he had already accepted his fate. Yet, his lack of remorse or acknowledgement of what he had done unsettled everyone in the room. He was placed in the back of the wagon for transport to a holding cell, a short drive meant to be routine. The vehicle rattled through the quiet streets, the weight of its cargo heavy in more ways than one. Inside, Josh sat alone, his head lowered, his hands bound. The officers in the front spoke little, the reality of the night's events hanging between them. When they arrived at the station, the officers exited the cab and unlocked the rear doors. What they found inside froze them in their tracks. Josh Morgan was slumped over, motionless. His belt, removed during processing, had been hidden within his clothing. Somehow, he had managed to secure it around his neck, using the wagon's metal grates as an anchor. By the time they found him, it was too late. He was gone. The officers called for medics, but the scene was clear. Josh had taken his own life. In doing so, he had ensured that the full truth of his actions, the motives that might have explained his descent into horror, would never be known. What drove him to such violence? Was it a final act of guilt or a deliberate way to silence the secrets he carried? No one would ever know. With Josh's death, the case that had shaken an entire neighborhood came to a sudden and incomplete end. The evidence told part of the story. The breach in the basement wall, the tools, and the horrific scene that had unfolded in the shadows of his home. But the most important answers, the why, were buried with Josh, leaving investigators and Helen's loved ones to piece together fragments of a nightmare. In the following days, the community struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew what the monster's actions revealed. Was Josh a victim of his mind, unraveling in isolation, or had he hidden his true nature behind the thin walls of civility? The neighbors, once content to look the other way, now questioned every glance, every noise, every moment they had shared space with him. The house that once held Helen's life and Josh's darkness now stood empty, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. The silence it left behind was deafening, a void filled with unanswered questions, shattered trust, and a lingering fear that would never quite fade. And so, the story ends not with justice but silence. Josh's death ensured that the full truth would remain hidden, locked away in a place no one could reach. Helen Carter's life, dreams, and future were stolen in a way that defied understanding, leaving behind only the haunting echoes of what might have been. The walls we build to separate ourselves are meant to protect, but sometimes they conceal horrors we can never imagine. A quiet neighborhood, a kind woman, and a neighbor whose darkness consumed them both. Behind a fragile wall, the unthinkable unfolded. What began as an ordinary life in an ordinary home ended in a way no one could have predicted. Helen Carter lived a life of kindness and simplicity, trusting the thin boundaries that separate her world from those around her. But the danger she faced wasn't distant or abstract. It was closer than she could have imagined. Josh Morgan's crime shattered more than just one life. It tore through the fragile sense of security that defined this community. The neighbors who had once shared friendly nods and casual greetings now found themselves questioning everything. How many red flags had they missed? How many warnings had gone ignored, dismissed as the eccentricities of a quiet, reclusive man? And most haunting of all, could this have been prevented? These walls, thin enough to carry every creak and whisper, were meant to separate and protect. But they had a darkness that no one could see until it was too late. Helen's story forces us to confront unsettling truths about the spaces we share with others. It makes us ask questions we may not want to face. How well do we truly know the people who live just beyond these barriers? What would you have done if you had heard those noises or seen those strange looks? Would you have acted, or would you have looked the other way? The answers may never come, which perhaps makes this story chilling. The silence that lingers, the questions left unanswered, weigh heavier than any explanation could. Josh Morgan's death closed the door on the full truth of what happened in that basement, leaving only fragments of a story that will haunt those who knew it. The tragedy of Helen Carter is not just a story of one life lost. It's a reminder of the unseen dangers that can hide in the most ordinary places. We build walls to separate, to protect, to create distance. But sometimes those walls aren't enough, and what lies just beyond them can change everything. As you hear this story, you might wonder, what noises would you ignore? What glances would you dismiss? How well do you know someone just a few feet away, sharing your walls, air, and world? The answers may not be comforting, but they are questions worth asking. The walls may be thin, but their secrets can haunt us forever. Until next time, stay safe and listen closely